Welcome, dear listener, to these gentle stories of grateful hearts. As you settle into the quiet comfort of this evening, let these tales of thanksgiving and wonder carry you into peaceful rest. Each story whispers of hearts that found joy in unexpected places, of souls that discovered beauty even in difficulty, and of the quiet magic that unfolds when we pause to notice the gifts surrounding us. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let these voices from across time remind you of the gentle power of a grateful spirit. In the ancient land where golden wheat swayed beneath endless skies, there lived a young woman whose heart had learned the weight of sorrow and the lightness of gratitude in equal measure. Ruth walked beside her mother-in-law Naomi along the dusty road that led from Moab back to Bethlehem, her bare feet finding rhythm with the older woman's slower steps. The sun painted long shadows across the earth as they travelled, two widows carrying nothing but their memories and a quiet hope that somewhere ahead life might offer them a place to belong again. Naomi's shoulders bore the invisible burden of loss. She had buried her husband and both her sons in foreign soil, and now she returned to her homeland with empty hands and a heart that felt as barren as winter fields. Yet Ruth had chosen to stay beside her, speaking words that would echo through generations. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. These were not words born of obligation, but of a gratitude so deep it transformed sacrifice into joy. As they approached the outskirts of Bethlehem, the barley harvest was beginning. Golden stalks bent in the evening breeze, whispering promises of bread and sustenance. Ruth looked upon these fields with eyes that saw opportunity where others might see only hard labour. She had learned to be grateful for the chance to work, for hands that could gather grain, for strength in her young body that could provide for them both. The morning came soft and pink, painting the harvest fields in gentle light. Ruth rose before dawn, her heart already turning toward the day's possibilities. She had heard of the custom that allowed the poor and the stranger to glean behind the reapers, gathering the grain that fell from their hands. What others might see as charity, Ruth received as providence. She was grateful for laws that protected the vulnerable, for a community that made space for those who had nothing. She made her way to the fields belonging to Boaz, though she did not yet know his name or his character. The field stretched before her like a sea of gold, already busy with workers whose voices carried on the morning air. Ruth approached the foreman with humble respect, asking permission to glean among the sheaves. Her words were few, but her manner spoke of dignity wrapped in gratitude. She was thankful for the courage to ask, for the opportunity to contribute, for the simple blessing of work that could put food on their meagre table. As the sun climbed higher, Ruth moved through the field with quiet determination. Her back ached as she bent again and again to gather the fallen grain, but her heart remained light. Each handful represented another day they could eat, another morning they could wake with hope. She found herself grateful for the smallest things, the shade of a cloud that passed over her head, the coolness of the grain in her palms, the rhythmic sound of the reaper's tools that created a music of provision. When Boaz arrived at midday to inspect his fields, he noticed Ruth immediately. There was something in the way she worked that caught his attention, not desperate or grasping, but steady and grateful, as if each stalk of grain were a gift to be received with reverence. He asked his foreman about her and learned her story. The foreign woman who had shown such loyalty to Naomi, who had left her own family and gods to care for her mother-in-law. Boaz watched Ruth for a long moment, seeing in her bent form something that stirred his own grateful heart. He had been blessed with abundant fields, with workers and wealth, and he understood that these blessings carried responsibility. He approached Ruth with gentle words, inviting her to stay in his fields, to drink from his workers' water jars, to glean freely without fear. His kindness was born from gratitude for his own abundance and a recognition of the divine spark in this faithful young woman. Ruth's eyes filled with tears at his unexpected kindness. She bowed her face to the ground, overwhelmed by grace she had not sought but received nonetheless. Her heart overflowed with thanksgiving, not just for the grain she could gather, but for the dignity with which she was being treated. She was grateful for Boaz's gentle words, for being seen as a person of worth rather than merely a poor foreigner. In that moment, her gratitude became a bridge between cultures, between stranger and neighbor, between need and provision. Throughout the afternoon, Ruth continued her work with renewed energy. Every stalk seemed to shine with possibility, every grain a small miracle of sustenance. She found herself grateful for the heat of the sun that would ripen more harvests, for the earth that yielded its treasure, for the hands that had planted and tended these fields. Her gratitude expanded beyond her immediate need to encompass the whole cycle of provision that surrounded her. As evening approached and the workers prepared to return to their homes, Boaz quietly instructed his men to deliberately drop extra grain in Ruth's path, to pull out stalks from the bundles and leave them for her to find. His generosity flowed from a heart grateful for the opportunity to bless others, understanding that kindness given freely returns to the giver in ways beyond measure. Ruth gathered her gleanings and found she had collected an ephah of barley far more than she had dared hope for. Her arms could barely carry the abundance as she made her way back to where Naomi waited. With each step, her heart sang with gratitude for provision that exceeded every expectation. She was thankful for the weight of the grain in her arms, for the promise of bread it represented, for the kindness of strangers who had shown her favor. When Naomi saw the abundance Ruth had gathered, her own heart began to stir with something she had almost forgotten hope, seasoned with gratitude. As Ruth told her about Boaz and his kindness, Naomi's eyes brightened with the recognition of God's faithful provision. She too began to remember the reasons for gratitude, for a daughter-in-law whose loyalty surpassed that of blood relations, for a community that welcomed them home, for the promise of sustenance in their time of need. Night after night, Ruth returned to Boaz's fields, and each day her gratitude deepened like roots finding water in dry ground. She was grateful for the routine of work, for the strength in her limbs, for the growing friendship with the other women who gleaned alongside her. She found joy in the simple act of providing for Naomi, in the way their small home began to feel less empty with the presence of grain and the promise of tomorrow's bread. The harvest season continued, and with it grew an understanding between Ruth and Boaz that ran deeper than words. He began to look for her among the workers each morning, grateful for the quiet joy her presence brought to his fields. She moved through her work with a grace that spoke of inner abundance even in outer simplicity. Their conversations were brief but meaningful, seasoned with mutual respect and a shared understanding of life's fragility and preciousness. Boaz found himself grateful for Ruth's presence in ways that surprised him. Her faithfulness to Naomi had stirred something in his own heart, a recognition of loyalty and love that transcended circumstance. He was thankful for the opportunity to show kindness, for the way Ruth received his gestures with such genuine appreciation that giving became its own reward. In her gratitude, he discovered the joy of generosity renewed. As the barley harvest gave way to the wheat harvest, Ruth continued her faithful gleaning, and her grateful heart continued to transform everything it touched. The other workers began to notice her quiet contentment, the way she found joy in simple things, the genuine thanks she offered for every small kindness. Her gratitude became contagious, spreading through the field like morning light, reminding others to notice the gifts they had grown accustomed to overlooking. One evening, as Ruth prepared to return home with another day's gathering, Boaz approached her with words that would change everything. He spoke of redemption, of his desire to become her kinsman redeemer, to make her not just a gleaner in his fields, but a full member of his family. His proposal was offered with the same generous spirit that had marked all his interactions with her, born from gratitude for the way she had enriched his life simply by being who she was. Ruth received his words with a heart so full of gratitude it seemed it might overflow. She was thankful not just for the security his offer represented, but for being loved for her character rather than despite her circumstances. She was grateful for a future that held promise, for a love that had grown from mutual respect and shared values, for the way God had used her faithfulness to Naomi to weave a story more beautiful than she had ever dared imagine. The wedding preparations were simple but filled with joy, as the community gathered to celebrate the union of Boaz and Ruth. Naomi's heart overflowed with gratitude as she watched Ruth, no longer the grieving widow who had left Moab, but a bride radiant with happiness and hope. The older woman was thankful for Ruth's loyalty that had brought them to this moment, for a God who had not forgotten them in their distress, for a future that promised grandchildren and the continuation of love beyond loss. In the years that followed, Ruth and Boaz's home became a place where gratitude lived and breathed in every corner. Their son Obed brought laughter to fill the spaces where sorrow had once dwelt. Ruth would tell him stories of the harvest fields where his parents had met, teaching him to be grateful for the grain that became bread, for the hands that worked the fields, for the kindness of those who help strangers find their way home. The fields where Ruth had once gleaned as a foreigner now belonged to her as family land, but she never forgot the lessons learned in those early days of gathering grain. She remained grateful for abundance and scarcity alike, understanding that both had shaped her heart and prepared her for the blessings that followed. Her story became part of the harvest song that workers sang as they gathered grain, a reminder that faithfulness and gratitude can transform the humblest circumstances into the beginning of great joy. Naomi, now a grandmother holding Obed in her arms, often reflected on the journey that had brought them from loss to abundance. She was grateful for Ruth's refusal to abandon her, for the way sorrow had been transformed into joy, for a God who had been faithful even when faithfulness seemed absent. Her heart had learned that gratitude could coexist with grief, that thanksgiving could grow even in the soil of loss, that hope could be reborn in the most unexpected ways. The story of Ruth's grateful heart rippled outward through generations, becoming part of the lineage that would produce kings and ultimately the Prince of Peace himself. But in those quiet moments as she worked in the fields, as she prepared bread for her family, as she watched the sun set over the land that had become her inheritance, Ruth simply lived in the present moment with a heart full of thanks. She had learned that gratitude was not just a response to good circumstances, but a way of seeing that could transform any circumstance into an opportunity for grace. In those same hills where Ruth had walked, where barley and wheat had whispered their songs of provision, another soul would learn the language of grateful praise. Young David, son of Jesse, moved among the sheep with a heart that overflowed with wonder at the world around him. His days began before dawn in the quiet pastures outside Bethlehem, where the first light painted the landscape in shades of hope, and the dew on grass sparkled like scattered diamonds waiting to be discovered by grateful eyes. David's hands were calloused from years of holding his shepherd's staff, but they were gentle hands that knew how to comfort frightened lambs and guide wandering sheep back to safety. As he watched over his father's flocks, his heart naturally turned toward thanksgiving for the simple miracles that surrounded him each day. He was grateful for the strength in his young arms, for eyes that could spot danger from afar, for the trust the sheep placed in his voice when he called them by name. The hills became his sanctuary, and the sky his cathedral ceiling. David would lie on his back in the grass during the quiet afternoon hours, watching clouds drift across the endless blue expanse above him, and his heart would swell with gratitude for the vastness of creation and his small but important place within it. He was thankful for the way the wind carried the scent of wildflowers, for the distant sound of water flowing over stones, for the warmth of sun on his face and the solid earth beneath his shoulders. Music seemed to flow from David's grateful heart as naturally as water from a spring. He had crafted himself a simple harp from olive wood and sheep's gut strings, and in the quiet hours, while his flock grazed peacefully, he would pluck melodies that matched the rhythm of his thanksgiving. His songs began as wordless tunes that captured the feeling of morning light breaking over the hills, the contentment of sheep safely gathered, the mysterious beauty of stars appearing in the darkening sky. Gradually, words began to attach themselves to David's melodies, words that expressed what his heart could barely contain. He sang of his gratitude for the Lord who was his shepherd, who led him beside still waters and restored his soul. These were not the formal hymns sung in the temple, but intimate conversations between a young heart and its creator, seasoned with the salt of honest emotion and the sweetness of genuine appreciation for life's daily gifts. When lions or bears threatened his flock, David's gratitude transformed into fierce protection. He was thankful for the courage that rose within him, for the sure aim of his sling, for the way his sheep trusted him to stand between them and danger. Each victory over predators became another verse in his ongoing song of praise, another reason to marvel at the provision and protection that surrounded them in the wilderness. His grateful heart saw the hand of God in his own steady aim and the confused retreat of wild beasts. The seasons turned, and David's songs deepened with his experience. During the scorching heat of summer, he was grateful for shaded valleys and cool streams. When winter rains turned the hills green and lush, he sang thanksgiving for the abundant grass that fattened his sheep and the fresh water that filled every depression in the rock. His gratitude was not dependent on comfort, but was woven into the very fabric of his awareness, making every moment a potential verse in his ongoing hymn of praise. One day, the prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem with oil for anointing, seeking the future king among Jesse's sons. David was called from the fields, still carrying the scent of sheep and wildflowers, his hands stained with earth, and his heart overflowing with the simple gratitude of a shepherd's life. When the holy oil touched his forehead, David felt the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders, but his first response was not pride, but overwhelming thankfulness for being chosen despite his youth, his humble occupation, his position as the youngest son. The anointing changed David's external circumstances, but his grateful heart remained constant. When he was summoned to play his harp for King Saul, soothing the troubled monarch's spirit with melodies born in the pastures, David was grateful for music that could heal, for songs that could drive away darkness, for the privilege of using his gifts in service to others. His psalms became medicine for Saul's tortured soul, though the young musician remained humble about his role, grateful simply to be an instrument through which peace could flow. The confrontation with Goliath became another expression of David's grateful faith. While others saw an impossible giant, David saw an opportunity to demonstrate gratitude for the God who had delivered him from lion and bear. His confidence was not in his own strength, but in his thankfulness for divine protection that had never failed him. When his stone found its mark and the giant fell, David's heart overflowed with gratitude for victory that belonged not to him, but to the God he served with such wholehearted appreciation. The years of fleeing from Saul's jealous rage became a different kind of pasture for David's growing faith. In caves and wilderness places, pursued by armies and betrayed by friends, David discovered that gratitude could flourish even in the darkest circumstances. His psalms from this period ring with honest complaint alongside steadfast thanksgiving, showing a heart that had learned to hold both sorrow and joy, both fear and faith, both desperation and deep abiding gratitude for God's unfailing love. In the cave of Adullam, surrounded by other outcasts and refugees, David wrote some of his most beautiful expressions of gratitude. He was thankful for companions who shared his exile, for the way hardship had refined his faith like silver in fire, for the countless times divine protection had kept him alive when death seemed certain. His songs became rallying cries for his followers, reminding them that even in hiding they were not forgotten, even in weakness they were held by strength greater than any earthly power. David's gratitude extended beyond his personal circumstances to encompass the whole sweep of God's faithfulness throughout history. He sang of creation itself as an expression of divine love, of the sun and moon as daily reminders of reliable provision, of mountains and seas as testimonies to power that could be trusted completely. His thanksgiving was cosmic in scope, yet intimate in detail, acknowledging the God who set the stars in their courses and also knew the number of hairs on his head. When David finally became king, his grateful heart did not forget the lessons learned in wilderness places. His first act was to bring the Ark of God to Jerusalem with such exuberant thanksgiving that he danced before it with all his might, his royal robes abandoned in favour of simple linen, as he celebrated like a shepherd boy grateful for his first glimpse of the holy. His gratitude knew no boundaries of protocol or pride, expressing itself in pure joy that scandalized the sophisticated but delighted the heart of heaven. The palace could not contain David's grateful worship any more than the hills had contained his shepherd's songs. He organized choirs and orchestras, appointing musicians to offer continuous thanksgiving in the temple, understanding that gratitude was not just a personal response, but a national need, a communal expression of dependence on divine goodness. His own psalms became the foundation for centuries of corporate worship, giving voice to humanity's deepest longings and highest praise. Even David's failures became occasions for a different kind of gratitude. When confronted with his sin regarding Bathsheba and Uriah, David's repentance was seasoned with thankfulness for a God whose love was greater than human faithfulness, whose mercy was new every morning, whose forgiveness could create clean hearts from the ashes of broken trust. His psalm of confession became a grateful acknowledgement that divine love persists even when human love fails, that grace is deeper than guilt, that restoration is always possible for truly repentant hearts. In his later years, as David prepared to pass the kingdom to Solomon, his gratitude took on the golden tones of mature reflection. He was thankful for a life that had been full of both triumph and trial, for the way each season had taught him new dimensions of divine faithfulness, for the privilege of leaving behind songs that would comfort and inspire generations yet unborn. His final psalms ring with the gratitude of a man who had tasted life fully and found it good, not because it was easy, but because it was meaningful, not because it was comfortable, but because it was held securely in hands that never let go. The boy who had watched sheep in quiet pastures had become the king who ruled a nation, but his heart remained fundamentally unchanged. David's gratitude was not dependent on his circumstances, but was the lens through which he viewed all circumstances. Whether tending sheep or ruling a kingdom, whether fleeing from enemies or celebrating victories, whether confessing sins or offering praise, his heart remained attuned to the countless reasons for thanksgiving that surrounded him every moment of every day. David's Psalms became the prayer book of his people and countless generations that followed, giving words to gratitude that transcends time and culture. His songs of thanksgiving continue to rise from hearts around the world, reminding all who hear them that life itself is a gift, that breath itself is grace, that every sunrise is a fresh invitation to recognize and receive the goodness that surrounds us in forms both seen and unseen. In the end, David's greatest legacy was not his kingdom or his conquests, but his grateful heart, expressed in songs that continue to teach others how to see the world through eyes of appreciation. He had learned that gratitude was not just an attitude, but a way of life, not just a response to blessing, but a doorway into blessing, not just a feeling, but a fundamental orientation toward existence that could transform any experience into an opportunity for wonder, worship, and deep abiding joy. Centuries later, in the bustling Roman city of Philippi, two men sat in the deepest part of the municipal prison, their backs raw from the beating they had received earlier that day. Paul and Silas bore the physical marks of their faithful preaching, their feet locked fast in wooden stocks, their bodies aching from the violence that had been their reward for bringing freedom to a demon-possessed slave girl. Yet in the suffocating darkness of that underground cell, something extraordinary was beginning to stir, not bitterness or despair, but the same spirit of gratitude that had sustained David in caves and Ruth in foreign fields. Paul's weathered hands, scarred from years of tent-making and marked by the chains of previous imprisonments, reached out in the darkness to find Silas beside him. The younger man's breathing was steady despite his pain, and Paul could sense in his companion the same unshakable foundation of thanksgiving that had carried them through countless trials across the Mediterranean world. They were grateful to be suffering together rather than alone, grateful for the bond of fellowship that made even a prison cell feel less confining when shared with a brother in faith. The other prisoners listened in the darkness as Paul began to speak softly to Silas, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine appreciation despite their circumstances. He was grateful, he whispered, for the opportunity to suffer for the sake of the gospel, for the privilege of being counted worthy to bear persecution for the name of Christ. His words were not the forced optimism of someone trying to make the best of a bad situation, but the natural overflow of a heart that had learned to find God's presence in every circumstance, even the most difficult ones. Silas responded with equal warmth, expressing his own gratitude for Paul's mentorship, for the journeys they had shared, for the churches they had planted together across the known world. He was thankful for the way their partnership had multiplied the effectiveness of their ministry, for the courage Paul had shown him through example, for the deepening of his own faith through witnessing Paul's unwavering trust in divine goodness, even when earthly circumstances seemed to suggest abandonment. As the night deepened and the prison grew quieter, Paul found himself remembering the road to Damascus, where his life had been completely transformed by an encounter with divine love. He was grateful for that moment of blinding light that had opened his eyes to truth, for the way his persecution of believers had been transformed into passionate advocacy for the very faith he had once tried to destroy. His gratitude extended backward to include even his former life as Saul, understanding now that every experience had been preparation for this calling to carry the gospel to the Gentiles. The stocks that held their feet became, in Paul's grateful imagination, reminders of the chains of sin and death from which they had been freed. He was thankful for physical bonds that could never touch the liberty of their spirits, for earthly imprisonment that only highlighted their eternal freedom, for temporary suffering that was producing in them an eternal weight of glory, far beyond anything they could ask or imagine. His perspective transformed their cell from a place of punishment into a place of opportunity, from a symbol of defeat into a staging ground for victory. Silas began to hum softly, a melody that carried the ancient words of David's Psalms, and Paul joined his voice to create a quiet harmony that rose through the darkness like incense. They were grateful for the heritage of faith that connected them to generations of believers who had sung God's praises in their own dark places, for the timeless truth that no circumstance could separate them from divine love, for the knowledge that their present suffering was temporary while their joy was eternal. Their gratitude was not theoretical, but deeply practical, rooted in countless experiences of divine faithfulness throughout their travels. Paul remembered Lydia's hospitality in this very city, the way her heart had been opened to receive the gospel, the warmth of her home where they had found rest and fellowship. He was grateful for her generous spirit, for the way she had insisted they stay with her family, for the foundation of faith she represented in this new Christian community. Silas recalled their journey through the regions of Phrygia and Galatia, where the Holy Spirit had prevented them from going into Asia, redirecting their steps toward Macedonia instead. He was grateful for divine guidance that sometimes came through closed doors rather than open ones, for the way apparent obstacles had led them to exactly where they needed to be, for the mysterious workings of providence that brought good from seeming setbacks. As midnight approached, their whispered conversation gradually became song. Paul's voice, rough from years of preaching in synagogues and marketplaces, blended with Silas's clearer tones to create melodies of thanksgiving that seemed to push back the darkness surrounding them. They sang of God's faithfulness through generations, of promises that never failed, of love that never let go, of hope that never disappointed those who placed their trust in divine goodness. The other prisoners, initially annoyed by the sound, found themselves listening despite themselves. There was something in these songs that they had never heard before, not the desperate cries of men trying to convince themselves that everything would be all right, but the confident celebration of men who had found something more valuable than physical freedom, something that could not be taken away by human authority or destroyed by earthly circumstance. Paul and Silas were grateful for their audience, understanding that even in prison they were still ministers of the gospel, still called to let their light shine in dark places. They sang not to convince themselves, but to declare truth, not to improve their situation, but to celebrate realities that transcended their situation. Their gratitude became a form of worship that transformed their cell into a sanctuary, their suffering into sacrifice, their imprisonment into opportunity. Their voices grew stronger as their gratitude deepened, no longer whispering, but singing aloud the great truths that had sustained them through every trial. They were grateful for the cross that had made their forgiveness possible, for the resurrection that guaranteed their hope, for the Spirit that empowered their service, for the promise of eternal life that made present hardships seem light and momentary. Their thanksgiving became a declaration of faith that echoed through the stone corridors of the prison like a challenge to every force that would attempt to silence truth. At the stroke of midnight, as their voices reached a crescendo of grateful praise, the earth itself seemed to respond to their worship. The ground beneath the prison began to tremble and shake, not with the violence of destruction, but with the power of liberation. Walls that had confined countless prisoners throughout the years groaned and shifted as divine intervention answered the prayers of grateful hearts with demonstration of unlimited power. The earthquake that shook Philippi was more than a natural phenomenon. It was a physical expression of spiritual truth, a manifestation of the reality that gratitude opens doors that human strength cannot budge, that praise creates possibilities that human wisdom cannot imagine, that worship unleashes power that human authority cannot contain. Paul and Silas felt their stocks snap open, heard the prison doors creak wide, understood that their thanksgiving had become the key to freedom they had not even requested. Yet their first response was not to flee, but to remain, not to escape, but to ensure that their fellow prisoners did not suffer for their liberation. Paul's voice rang out through the darkness, assuring the terrified jailer that all prisoners were accounted for, that this miracle had not been for their benefit alone, but for the salvation of all who would receive it. His gratitude extended even to their captor, understanding that God's love encompassed every person in that place of bondage. The jailer, trembling before this demonstration of divine power, fell at their feet asking what he must do to be saved. Paul and Silas, their own wounds forgotten in their concern for his spiritual need, shared the simple message of faith that had transformed their own lives and continued to sustain them through every trial. They were grateful for this opportunity to lead another soul from darkness to light, for the way their suffering had become the pathway to this man's salvation, for the privilege of seeing fear transformed into faith before their very eyes. Before dawn broke over Philippi, the jailer had washed their wounds and been washed himself in the waters of baptism. His entire household had heard the gospel and believed, and his home had been transformed from a place of duty into a place of celebration. Paul and Silas were grateful for this unexpected feast, for the way their night of imprisonment had become a morning of freedom for an entire family, for the mysterious workings of grace that brought salvation through suffering, joy through persecution, victory through apparent defeat. When the magistrates sent word the next morning that they were free to go, Paul insisted on a public acknowledgement of their Roman citizenship and the illegal nature of their treatment. His response was not born of wounded pride, but of grateful stewardship for the rights that could protect other believers in the future. He was thankful for citizenship that could serve the gospel, for legal protections that might shield others from unnecessary suffering, for the opportunity to establish precedents that would benefit the growing Christian community. Their departure from Philippi was marked by the same gratitude that had characterized their imprisonment. They were thankful for Lydia's continued hospitality, for the strengthened faith of new believers who had witnessed divine power in action, for the foundation that had been laid for a church that would become one of Paul's greatest sources of joy in future years. Their brief stay in the city had been marked by opposition and suffering, but their grateful hearts saw only the abundant fruit that had grown from the soil of their sacrifice. As they travelled on to Thessalonica, Paul and Silas carried with them more than just the memory of miraculous deliverance. They had experienced afresh the truth that gratitude could transform any prison into a place of worship, any suffering into an opportunity for testimony, any setback into a setup for divine intervention. Their grateful hearts had learned once again that circumstances need not determine response, that external bondage could not touch internal freedom, that the darkest midnight could become the birthplace of the brightest dawn. The church in Philippi would later send Paul support during his imprisonments in other cities, and he would write to them with overflowing gratitude for their partnership in the gospel from the first day until his letter reached them. Their relationship, born in a prison cell and baptized in grateful praise, became a model of the way suffering shared in faith creates bonds stronger than chains, foundations deeper than any earthly institution, joy more lasting than any temporary circumstance. Along the border between Samaria and Galilee, where the road wound through rocky hills dotted with olive trees and wild herbs, 10 men made their way slowly toward a village that had become both their destination and their forbidden territory. Their bodies bore the terrible marks of leprosy, their skin mottled and scarred by the disease that had stolen not only their health, but their place in society, their connections to family, their hope for any future beyond the slow progression of their affliction. They travelled together because isolation shared was somehow more bearable than isolation endured alone. Among them was a Samaritan named Josiah, whose presence with the Jewish lepers was itself a testimony to how great suffering could break down the barriers that separated people in ordinary times. Disease had made them equals in misery, united in their desperate need for healing that seemed impossible, bound together by the common thread of hope that refused to die even in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances. Josiah had been a merchant before the spots appeared on his skin, a man who had travelled the trade routes between Jerusalem and Damascus, whose purse had been heavy with silver and whose future had seemed secure. The diagnosis had come like a thunderclap, stripping away in an instant everything he had worked to build. Yet even in the early days of his exile from normal life, Josiah had found small reasons for gratitude, for the other outcasts who had welcomed him into their community of the afflicted, for the kindness of strangers who sometimes left food where they could find it, for each morning that brought the gift of another day of life, however diminished. The 10 men had heard rumours of a teacher from Nazareth who healed the sick, who touched the untouchable, who seemed to have power over every disease that afflicted humanity. Hope had kindled in their hearts like a small flame in wind, fragile but persistent, growing stronger with each story that reached their ears. They were grateful for hope itself, for the possibility of possibility, for the way anticipation could make even their current suffering seem less permanent, less final. As they approached the village where Jesus was reported to be staying, Josiah felt his heart racing with a mixture of fear and expectation. He was grateful for the courage of his companions, for the way they had decided together to seek out this healer, despite the risk of disappointing their fragile hopes. They had agreed to stand at a distance, as the law required, to call out their need without approaching close enough to defile those who were clean, to respect the boundaries while still crying out for mercy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty road as they positioned themselves where they could see the gate of the village. Josiah found himself grateful for the warmth on his damaged skin, for eyes that could still see the beauty of light and shadow, for ears that could hear the sounds of normal life continuing beyond their reach. Even in his affliction, he had learned to notice gifts that health had once made invisible: the simple miracle of breathing, the wonder of consciousness, the possibility that each day might bring unexpected grace. When Jesus emerged from the village gate, surrounded by his disciples and a small crowd of followers, Josiah felt his breath catch in his throat. The teacher looked smaller than he had imagined, more ordinary, yet there was something in his bearing that made Josiah's heart leap with recognition of authority and compassion combined in ways he had never seen before. He was grateful for this moment of seeing, for the opportunity to look upon the face of one who might hold the key to their restoration, for the kindness in those eyes that seemed to see past their disfigurement to their essential humanity. Together, the 10 men raised their voices in the ritual cry of the unclean, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Their words carried across the space between them like a bridge spanning the gulf that separated their isolation from the world of health and wholeness. Josiah was grateful for the strength in his voice despite the weakness in his body, for the unity of their appeal, for the courage to ask for what seemed impossible while accepting that refusal was more likely than acceptance. Jesus stopped when he heard their call, turning toward them with an expression that held no revulsion or fear, only compassion that seemed to reach across the distance and touch each of them individually. Josiah felt tears spring to his eyes at the simple gift of being seen, really seen, by someone who looked at them with love rather than disgust. He was grateful for this moment of recognition, for being acknowledged as human beings worthy of attention and care, for the way hope surged through his entire being like water in a drought-stricken land. The teacher's voice carried clearly across the space between them. "Go, show yourselves to the priests." The words seemed simple, almost ordinary, yet they implied something extraordinary, that there would be something for the priests to see, some change that would require official verification. Josiah felt his heart pounding as he tried to understand what he had heard. Was this the healing they had sought? Was their restoration contained somehow in this simple command to go and be examined by religious authorities? The 10 lepers looked at each other with expressions of confusion and dawning hope. To go to the priests implied that they expected to be declared clean, that they believed healing had occurred even though they could see no immediate change in their condition. Josiah was grateful for the faith of his companions, for the way they began to move without question toward Jerusalem where the priests could be found, for the trust they placed in words that asked them to act as if their healing was already accomplished. As they walked, Josiah found himself examining his hands, looking for any sign of change in skin that had been mottled and diseased for so many years. At first he saw nothing different, and doubt began to whisper in his mind that they had been foolish to hope, naive to believe that simple words could accomplish what years of prayer and treatment had failed to achieve. Yet he was grateful even for doubt, understanding that it was the natural companion of faith, the shadow that made light more precious, the testing that proved hope genuine. But then, as the sun climbed higher and their journey continued, Josiah began to notice something remarkable happening to his hands. The diseased patches were fading, the rough texture becoming smooth, the dead sensation giving way to normal feeling. He stopped walking and stared at his palms in amazement, watching in real time as his skin transformed from the mottled pattern of leprosy to the healthy pink of normal flesh. His heart overflowed with gratitude for this impossible gift, for healing that was occurring even as he watched, for the restoration of his body happening cell by cell before his very eyes. The other 9 men were experiencing the same miraculous transformation, their exclamations of joy and amazement filling the air as they witnessed their own restoration. They embraced each other with tears of relief and celebration, their grateful hearts overflowing with plans for reuniting with families, returning to occupations, reclaiming lives that had been interrupted by disease. Josiah shared their joy, but something deeper was stirring in his spirit, a recognition that this healing was more than just physical restoration, that it was a gift that demanded acknowledgement, a miracle that called for response. While his 9 companions continued toward Jerusalem, caught up in the excitement of their healing and eager to receive official confirmation of their restoration, Josiah felt compelled to turn back. He was grateful for the healing, but he was even more grateful for the healer, and something in his heart insisted that such a gift could not be received without thanksgiving, that such grace could not be accepted without acknowledgement of its source. The return journey felt different from the outward one. Where before he had walked as an outcast hoping for mercy, now he walked as a whole man seeking to offer gratitude. Where before his steps had been hesitant with uncertainty, now they were quick with purpose. Where before he had kept his distance as the law required, now he approached with the freedom of one who had been declared clean by divine power rather than priestly examination. Josiah found Jesus in the courtyard of a house where he was teaching a group of listeners. Without concern for protocol or propriety, the former leper fell at the teacher's feet, his heart so full of gratitude that he could barely find words to express it. He was thankful not only for his healing, but for the love that had motivated it, not only for his restored body, but for the grace that had made restoration possible, not only for his own miracle, but for belonging to a God who worked such wonders on behalf of those who had no claim on divine attention except their desperate need. Jesus looked down at the man prostrate before him with an expression of gentle sadness mixed with joy. "Were not 10 cleansed?" he asked those around him. "Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" His words highlighted the tragedy of ungrateful hearts that could receive miracle and move on without acknowledgement, that could be healed without being transformed, that could gain physical restoration while missing spiritual revelation. Josiah felt no judgment toward his 9 companions, understanding how overwhelming their joy must be, how eager they were to reconnect with their former lives. But he was grateful that something in his own heart had recognized the need to return, had understood that healing received without thanksgiving given was incomplete, that miracles acknowledged became foundations for faith, while miracles taken for granted became merely interesting experiences that faded with time. Jesus reached down and touched Josiah's shoulder, lifting him from his prostrate position to look into his eyes. "Rise and go your way," the teacher said with infinite gentleness. "Your faith has made you well." The words carried a deeper meaning than physical healing. They spoke of wholeness that encompassed body and spirit, of restoration that went beyond skin deep to touch the very core of being, of wellness that included the ability to recognize and respond to grace with appropriate gratitude. As Josiah rose to his feet, he understood that his healing was complete in ways that went far beyond the restoration of his skin. He was grateful for physical wellness, but he was even more grateful for the spiritual insight that had compelled him to return, for the understanding that miracles were not just events to be experienced, but gifts to be acknowledged, for the recognition that the giver was more important than the gift, however wonderful the gift might be. The former leper returned to his community not just as a healed man, but as a changed one. His gratitude had transformed him from someone who had received a miracle into someone who understood the heart of the miracle worker. He was thankful for restored relationships with family and friends, for the opportunity to resume his trade, for all the normal pleasures of life in society that he had lost and found again. But more than any of these, he was grateful for the encounter with divine love that had not only healed his body, but had opened his eyes to see God's fingerprints on every good gift in his life. Josiah's story spread throughout Samaria and beyond, not just as an account of miraculous healing, but as a testimony to the power of grateful recognition. People who heard him speak were struck not only by the wonder of his physical restoration, but by the depth of his spiritual transformation. His gratitude had become contagious, inspiring others to notice the gifts they had received without acknowledgement, to recognize the sources of blessings they had taken for granted, to understand that thanksgiving was not just polite response, but spiritual necessity. In the years that followed, Josiah became known throughout the region as the leper who returned, the Samaritan whose gratitude had made him more whole than healing alone could accomplish. His former isolation had been transformed into a ministry of encouragement. His experience of desperate need had become a foundation for helping others recognize their own dependence on divine grace. His grateful heart had become a living testimony to the truth that acknowledgement amplifies blessing, while ingratitude diminishes even the greatest gifts. Whenever Josiah told his story, he would always emphasize that the physical healing, wonderful as it was, had been only the beginning. The real miracle, he would say, was the way gratitude had opened his eyes to see that every day was full of gifts, every breath was a grace, every relationship was a blessing, every ordinary moment was shot through with the extraordinary presence of divine love waiting to be recognized and received with thanksgiving. In the village of Bethany, where the evening shadows fell gently across olive groves and the scent of jasmine drifted through narrow streets, a woman named Mary sat in her chamber holding a small jar that contained more than precious perfume. It held the concentrated essence of her gratitude, her love, and her understanding of grace that went deeper than words could express. The alabaster vessel was cool in her hands, its smooth surface reflecting the oil lamp that burned nearby, its contents representing years of careful saving and a heart that had found its reason for extravagant thanksgiving. Mary's fingers traced the carved surface of the jar as her mind wandered back to the day when her life had been forever changed by an encounter with divine love incarnate. She had been a woman known throughout Bethany for reasons that brought shame rather than honor, her reputation preceding her wherever she went, her past creating barriers that seemed impossible to cross. Yet grace had found her even in the depths of her despair. Love had reached her even when she felt most unworthy of love. Forgiveness had transformed her even when transformation seemed beyond hope or possibility. The alabaster jar had been purchased during her former life, when she had money from sources that now filled her with regret, when her existence had been defined by emptiness masquerading as pleasure, loneliness disguised as popularity, desperation hidden beneath layers of cosmetic beauty. She had bought the expensive perfume as part of her professional tools, never imagining that one day it would become the vehicle for expressing a gratitude so profound that it could only be communicated through radical generosity, through sacrifice that appeared foolish to observers but felt necessary to a heart overflowing with love. The transformation had come through Jesus, whose presence in her life had been like light entering a room that had been dark for so long she had forgotten what illumination looked like. He had seen past her reputation to her humanity, past her profession to her potential, past her past to her possibility for redemption. Mary was grateful for eyes that had looked at her with compassion instead of condemnation, for words that had offered forgiveness instead of judgment, for a love that had surrounded her brokenness and made it whole again. Her brother Lazarus and sister Martha had welcomed her transformation with tears of joy, grateful themselves for the return of the sister they had thought lost forever to shame and degradation. The family had been reunited not just by blood, but by shared faith, their home becoming a place where Jesus often found rest and refreshment during his travels through Judea. Mary was thankful for the restoration of family relationships, for the way grace had healed not only her own wounds, but the pain her choices had caused those who loved her most. Now, as she prepared for what she sensed would be one of her last opportunities to express her gratitude to the one who had saved her, Mary felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a sacred silence. Jesus was dining in the home of Simon the leper, another life that had been touched by divine healing, another soul who understood the depth of debt that grace could cancel. She was grateful for this gathering of people whose lives had been transformed by mercy, for the opportunity to be among those who knew from experience the reality of divine love. The jar in her hands represented more than money. It was her security, her insurance against future need, her most valuable possession in a world where women had few resources and fewer options. To break it open would be to pour out not just perfume, but her entire earthly treasure, to hold nothing back in reserve, to trust completely in divine provision for whatever future awaited her. Mary was grateful for the courage that was rising in her heart, for the certainty that love given freely was never wasted, for the understanding that extravagant gratitude was the only appropriate response to extravagant grace. As she made her way through the evening streets towards Simon's house, Mary could hear the sounds of dinner conversation drifting through the open windows, the voices of men discussing the events of the day, the comfortable murmur of fellowship among friends. She was grateful for communities that had learned to welcome those who had been outcasts, for tables that made room for those who had been excluded, for the radical inclusivity that seemed to follow in Jesus' wake wherever he went. The perfume inside the alabaster jar was spikenard, imported from distant mountains, worth a year's wages for a common labourer. Its fragrance was concentrated and precious, designed to be used sparingly over many years, to be reserved for the most special occasions. But Mary's gratitude could not be measured in normal terms, could not be expressed through careful calculation or prudent reserve. Her thankfulness demanded everything, called for complete abandon, insisted on giving all because all had been given to her. She entered Simon's house quietly, grateful for the customs that allowed women to serve even when they were not invited to recline at table with the men. Her presence went unnoticed at first as she moved toward the place where Jesus reclined, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation and overwhelming love. She was thankful for this moment, for the opportunity to translate her inner gratitude into outer expression, for the chance to demonstrate through action what words could never adequately convey. Without announcement or explanation, Mary knelt behind Jesus and raised the alabaster jar above her head. For a moment she hesitated, not from doubt but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. This act would mark her as either wonderfully devoted or tragically wasteful, depending on the observer's understanding of love's economics. She was grateful for the certainty in her heart that love's logic transcended worldly wisdom, that gratitude given freely could never be excessive, that nothing offered to divine love could ever be considered waste. The sound of breaking alabaster cut through the dinner conversation like a bell announcing something sacred and irreversible. The precious perfume poured over Jesus' head and feet, its fragrance immediately filling the room with an aroma so rich and concentrated that it seemed to transform the very atmosphere. Mary's hands, wet with perfume, began to wash Jesus' feet with her tears of gratitude, drying them with her long hair in an act of service that came from the deepest place in her grateful heart. The response was immediate and divided. Some of the disciples, led by Judas, began to murmur about the waste of such expensive perfume, calculating its worth and imagining all the practical uses to which that money could have been put. Their economic reasoning was sound from a worldly perspective, but it missed entirely the spiritual mathematics at work in Mary's sacrifice. She was grateful for their concern for the poor, but her heart understood that this moment called for something beyond prudent charity, something that could only be accomplished through extravagant love. Jesus' response silenced the criticism and vindicated Mary's grateful offering. "Leave her alone," he said with gentle authority. "She has done a beautiful thing for me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." His words transformed Mary's act from apparent waste into prophetic preparation. from foolish excess into wise investment in eternal significance. She was grateful for his understanding, for his protection of her gift, for his recognition that love expressed through sacrifice was never misplaced. The fragrance of the spilled perfume lingered not just in the room, but in memory, becoming a permanent testimony to the power of grateful love to transform ordinary moments into eternal significance. Mary's offering had been given without thought of recognition or reward, yet Jesus declared that wherever the gospel was preached throughout the world, her story would be told as a memorial to her faithful gratitude. She was thankful for becoming part of a story larger than her own life, for the way her personal gratitude had become a universal example of devotion. In the days that followed, as events moved rapidly toward the cross, Mary's anointing took on prophetic significance that even she had not fully understood in the moment of giving. The perfume that had poured over Jesus' body became preparation for burial, her grateful worship becoming inadvertent participation in the greatest act of love the world would ever witness. She was grateful for being allowed to contribute something beautiful to the story of redemption, for the way her grateful heart had been guided to participate in divine purposes beyond her comprehension. The alabaster jar, once broken, could never be made whole again, just as Mary's life had been irreversibly changed by her encounter with grace. But the brokenness had released beauty that filled not just a room, but became part of the eternal narrative of love's triumph over death, gratitude's victory over despair, sacrificial worship's transformation of ordinary moments into sacred memory. She was grateful for the breaking that had allowed blessing to flow, for the loss that had become the greatest gain imaginable. Mary's act of grateful worship became a template for all who would follow, showing that authentic gratitude could not be contained within socially acceptable limits, that true thankfulness demanded everything rather than something, that love received required love, given without reservation or calculation. Her story encouraged others to break their own alabaster jars, to pour out their own precious offerings, to express their own gratitude through acts that might appear foolish to the world, but were beautiful in the eyes of divine love. The woman who had once been known throughout Bethany for her shame became known throughout history for her grateful worship. Her grateful heart had transformed not only her own life, but had created a moment of beauty that would inspire countless others to examine their own gratitude, to consider their own offerings, to break their own jars in expressions of thanksgiving that transcended economic logic and entered the realm of love's extravagance. In the end, Mary's alabaster jar became a symbol of gratitude that holds nothing back, love that counts no cost too great, worship that pours itself out completely because it has received beyond measure. Her grateful heart had learned that divine love could not be repaid but could be celebrated, could not be earned but could be acknowledged, could not be deserved but could be received with thanksgiving so profound that it transformed the receiver into a living expression of gratitude, a broken vessel from which the fragrance of divine love could flow freely into a world desperate for the hope of grace. In a small cottage at the edge of a village, where roses climbed stone walls and morning glories wound around weathered fence posts, an elderly widow named Hannah discovered that the smallest gifts often carried the deepest joy when received by a grateful heart. Her home was modest, her possessions few, her income barely sufficient for her simple needs, yet her days overflowed with thanksgiving for blessings that others might overlook in their pursuit of grander pleasures and more substantial securities. Hannah's morning routine had become a ritual of recognition, a daily practice of noticing gifts that arrived wrapped in ordinary moments. She was grateful for the first light that crept through her bedroom window, painting patterns on the faded quilt her mother had stitched decades before. The warmth of that inherited coverlet carried more than physical comfort. It held memories of love, stories of family, the tangible presence of connections that transcended the boundaries of time and mortality. Her kettle sang its cheerful song as she prepared her morning tea, and Hannah found herself thankful for the simple melody that marked the beginning of each new day. The steam that rose from her cup carried the fragrance of Earl Grey, a small luxury she allowed herself because gratitude had taught her that appreciation could transform even modest pleasures into profound contentments. She was grateful for taste buds that still responded to flavour, for the warmth that spread through her aging hands as she wrapped them around the ceramic mug, for the ritual that connected her to countless other mornings and millions of other souls who found comfort in tea's simple ceremony. From her kitchen window, Hannah could see the garden that had become both her occupation and her meditation. Each plant represented not just beauty or sustenance, but a partnership with divine creativity, a collaboration between human effort and natural grace that produced results far beyond what either could accomplish alone. She was grateful for soil that accepted seeds with patient hospitality, for rain that fell without human scheduling or control, for sun that rose each morning with reliable generosity, asking nothing in return for the light and warmth that made all life possible. Her neighbour Mrs. Chen often paused at the garden gate during her morning walks, drawn by the beauty of flowers that seemed to bloom with unusual abundance, despite Hannah's limited resources for fertilizer or fancy tools. The elderly Chinese woman had become a dear friend through their shared appreciation for growing things, their friendship bridging cultural differences through the universal language of gratitude for nature's gifts. Hannah was thankful for this unexpected companionship, for the way loneliness had been transformed into fellowship through their mutual wonder at the mystery of seeds becoming flowers, earth becoming beauty, patience becoming harvest. The two women would often share tea in Hannah's small kitchen, their conversations flowing between English and the few Chinese phrases Hannah had learned, supplemented by gestures and laughter that needed no translation. Mrs. Chen would bring vegetables from her own garden, and Hannah would respond with flowers or herbs, their exchanges creating an economy of gratitude that enriched both households far beyond the value of what was traded. Hannah was grateful for generosity that multiplied when shared, for the way small gifts given with love became large blessings in the receiving, for friendship that proved community could be created one act of kindness at a time. Hannah's gratitude extended beyond her own dooryard to encompass the entire village that had become her world. She was thankful for the postal carrier who always had a cheerful word and never seemed hurried despite his heavy schedule, for the young mother who lived across the street and occasionally needed someone to watch her toddler while she ran errands, for the opportunity to feel useful despite her advanced years and limited strength. When baby Emma visited, Hannah's cottage filled with the sounds of childhood wonder toys scattered across the worn carpet, picture books read in voices that created magical worlds from simple words, afternoon naps that brought blessed quiet after joyful chaos. Hannah was grateful for these glimpses into the next generation, for the trust placed in her by Emma's busy mother, for the way caring for a child had awakened parts of her heart that she had thought permanently retired with her own children's departure into adulthood. The seasons mark time in Hannah's grateful awareness, like chapters in an ongoing story of divine faithfulness. Spring brought the miracle of resurrection as bulbs she had planted the previous autumn pushed through cold earth to announce that winter's death was temporary, that beauty could return even after the longest darkness. She was grateful for crocuses that bloomed despite snow, for daffodils that proved hope could survive underground, waiting for the right moment to emerge, for the way nature taught lessons about faith through the simple rhythm of dormancy and renewal. Summer blessed her with abundance that went far beyond her ability to consume or preserve. Tomatoes ripened faster than she could eat them. Herbs grew with such enthusiasm that she could hardly keep them pruned. Flowers bloomed in succession that kept her small vases filled throughout the warm months. Hannah was grateful for surplus that could be shared, for neighbours who appreciated fresh vegetables, for the simple joy of knocking on doors with gifts that cost nothing but labour and brought smiles that were worth more than money. Autumn painted her world in shades of thanksgiving, the very air seeming to celebrate the harvest season with colours that no human artist could improve upon. Hannah was grateful for the privilege of witnessing this annual masterpiece, for eyes that could still distinguish the subtle differences between gold and amber, scarlet and crimson, for the way beauty continued to surprise her even after decades of October afternoons in the same small garden. Winter stripped away summer's abundance, but revealed different gifts that warm weather had hidden. Hannah was grateful for the stark beauty of bare branches against grey skies, for the way snow transformed familiar landscapes into wonderlands worthy of fairy tales, for the cosy comfort of her small home when wind rattled windows and reminded her of shelter's blessing. She appreciated the season's invitation to rest, to reflect, to prepare in quiet darkness for the eventual return of light and growth. Hannah's practice of gratitude had begun during her husband's final illness, when sorrow threatened to overwhelm every other emotion and despair seemed more logical than hope. Watching Robert fade slowly from the vital man he had been to the fragile patient he became had initially filled her with anger and questions that had no satisfactory answers. But gradually, through necessity more than choice, she had begun to notice small gifts even in the midst of overwhelming loss. A lucid moment when his eyes recognized her completely, a pain-free hour when he could enjoy his favorite music, the gentle care of hospice workers who treated his dignity as carefully as they managed his symptoms. After Robert's death, gratitude had become Hannah's lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of despair that beckoned like a dark ocean threatening to swallow her entirely. She was grateful for 53 years of marriage that had given her memories sufficient to warm countless lonely evenings, for children and grandchildren who called regularly and visited when they could, for the surprising discovery that solitude need not mean loneliness when it was seasoned with appreciation for life's continuing gifts. The village pastor, Father Michael, had become a regular visitor, drawn initially by pastoral duty, but returning because of genuine affection for Hannah's grateful spirit. Their conversations ranged widely across theology and gardening, memory and hope, loss and discovery, always returning to the theme that ran through Hannah's life like a golden thread, the conviction that gratitude could transform any circumstance, that thanksgiving was not just an appropriate response to blessing, but a doorway through which additional blessings could enter even the most challenging situations. Father Michael was grateful himself for Hannah's influence on his own spiritual life, for the way her simple faith had challenged his theological sophistication, for lessons in practical gratitude that no seminary had taught him. He often left her cottage feeling blessed rather than having given blessing, ministered to rather than having provided ministry, reminded that divine grace often worked through the humble and overlooked, rather than through the prominent and powerful. Hannah's influence began to ripple outward through the village in ways she never intended or imagined. Mrs. Chen started bringing other neighbours to meet the woman whose garden bloomed with such unusual beauty, whose gratitude was as contagious as laughter, whose simple contentment seemed to offer a different way of measuring life's success. These informal gatherings in Hannah's small parlour became inadvertent lessons in appreciation, teaching participants to notice gifts they had previously overlooked, to find joy in simple pleasures they had dismissed as insufficient. Young Emma's mother, Sarah, found herself looking forward to conversations with Hannah almost as much as her daughter enjoyed playing in the cottage's child-friendly environment. The older woman's perspective on life's priorities had begun to influence Sarah's choices about work and family, helping her recognise that being present for small moments might be more important than achieving ambitious career goals, that gratitude for current blessings might be wiser than anxiety about future securities. The postal carrier began timing his route to allow extra minutes for conversation with Hannah, finding that her grateful responses to life's small courtesies reminded him that his work had meaning beyond simply delivering mail. Her appreciation for his reliability and kindness had made him more conscious of other opportunities throughout his day to brighten someone's routine with genuine attention and care. Even the local grocery store clerk had been touched by Hannah's influence, noting how the elderly woman always thanked him by name, always seemed genuinely pleased to see him, always treated their brief transaction as an opportunity for human connection rather than mere commercial exchange. Her gratitude had made him more conscious of his own attitude toward customers, more aware of opportunities to add warmth to routine interactions. Hannah's grateful heart had become a quiet ministry that touched lives without fanfare or formal organization, proving that gratitude shared multiplied naturally, that appreciation expressed inspired appreciation in others, that Thanksgiving lived authentically created communities of contentment that transcended differences of age, culture, economics, or circumstance. In the quiet hours of evening, as Hannah sat in her favourite chair, reading or simply watching shadows lengthen across her garden, she marvelled at the fullness that could be found in a life that the world might consider small or unremarkable. She was grateful for discovering that significance did not require scale, that meaning could be found in margins, that a heart attentive to gifts could find abundance in circumstances that might appear limited to less appreciative eyes. Her days had taught her that gratitude was not just an attitude, but a way of seeing, not just a feeling, but a practice, not just a response, but a choice that could be made fresh each morning regardless of external circumstances. She had learned that Thanksgiving was not reserved for special occasions, but was appropriate for ordinary moments, that appreciation could transform routine into ritual, mundane into meaningful, simple into sacred. As sleep approached each night, Hannah's final thoughts were always thanksgiving for the day's gifts received and given, for opportunities to notice beauty and share joy, for the mysterious way that contentment could expand to fill any space when it was not grasped too tightly, but held with open hands that were always ready to receive new blessings and release old ones with equal grace. On the outskirts of the city, where suburban streets gave way to rolling hills and old farmland, waited patiently for development that might never come. An elderly man named Samuel tended a garden that told the story of a lifetime measured not in years, but in moments of profound gratitude. Each plant, each path, each carefully placed stone carried memories of people loved, lessons learned, and grace received in forms both expected and surprising. His weathered hands moved among the flowers and vegetables with the reverence of one who understood that gardens were more than collections of plants. They were living libraries of thanksgiving, growing testaments to the countless ways life had exceeded his ability to deserve its goodness. Samuel had begun this garden 40 years earlier, newly married and full of dreams that seemed as limitless as the sky above the empty acre he and Margaret had purchased with their combined savings and considerable optimism. The soil had been poor then, heavy clay that fought every attempt at cultivation, but his grateful heart had seen potential rather than problems, possibility rather than obstacles. He was thankful for land of their own, however challenging, for the opportunity to build something beautiful from scratch, for the way shared labour could deepen love between husband and wife as they worked side by side toward common goals. The first plantings had been practical vegetables to supplement their modest grocery budget, fruit trees that would provide abundance in future years, herbs that would flavour meals and heal minor ailments with the wisdom his grandmother had passed down through stories and gentle instruction. Margaret had insisted on flowers even when money was tight and space was limited, understanding instinctively that beauty was not luxury but necessity, that gratitude required expression in forms that served no purpose except joy. Samuel was grateful for her wisdom, for the way she had insisted on planting hope alongside necessity, dreams alongside pragmatism. Each year had brought new additions to the garden as their circumstances improved and their understanding deepened. When Margaret's mother moved in with them during her final illness, they planted a rose garden beneath her bedroom window, choosing varieties that would bloom in succession throughout the growing season, providing continuous beauty for eyes that could no longer see clearly but could still appreciate colour and fragrance. Samuel was grateful for those months of caring for someone who had cared for the woman he loved, for the way death could be softened by beauty, for roses that continued to bloom year after year as living memorials to grace received and given. The birth of their first child, Anna, had been celebrated with the planting of an apple tree that now towered over the garden's eastern boundary, its branches heavy each autumn with fruit that fed not only their family, but neighbours and strangers who stopped to admire the abundance. Samuel was grateful for the way that tree had grown alongside his daughter, marking her progress from infant to child to woman to mother herself, its steady growth a reminder that some blessings compound over time, becoming more valuable with each passing season. When their son David had struggled through adolescent rebellion and eventual redemption, Samuel had planted a grove of birch trees that stood like silver sentinels along the garden's northern edge, their bark scarred but beautiful, their survival through harsh winters a testament to resilience and the possibility of renewal even after damage. He was grateful for the way those trees had taught him patience during difficult years, for the reminder that growth sometimes happens slowly and underground before becoming visible, for the hope that even the most troubled seasons could give way to spring. Margaret's death 10 years earlier had nearly ended Samuel's care for the garden. Grief had made every bloom a reminder of loss, every harvest a celebration that felt inappropriate without her presence to share the abundance. For months he had neglected the plants she had loved most, unable to bear the weight of memories that seemed too heavy for his aging shoulders. But gradually, gratitude had begun to heal what sorrow had broken, helping him understand that the garden was not a monument to loss, but a celebration of love that continued beyond the boundaries of mortality. Now, at 83, Samuel found himself grateful for every morning that brought strength enough to tend the plants that had become his partners in the ongoing conversation between human hope and divine providence. His movements were slower than they had been. His back protested against the bending and lifting that gardening required, but his heart remained quick to notice gifts that each day brought to those willing to receive them with appropriate appreciation. The memorial section of the garden had grown over the years as friends and family members completed their earthly journeys and found their final rest in soil that Samuel's grateful hands had prepared for them. Margaret's favourite peonies bloomed each June in massive profusion, their fragrance carrying memories of anniversary bouquets and kitchen table conversations that had shaped decades of married contentment. His parents were remembered through the heirloom tomatoes his father had grown and his mother had canned, their legacy living on in seeds saved and shared, in knowledge passed down through generations of grateful cultivation. Young people from the neighbourhood had begun to discover Samuel's garden through word of mouth and the mysterious attraction that draws seeking souls to places where gratitude has taken root and flourished. They came initially out of curiosity about the elderly man who seemed to coax unusual beauty from ordinary soil, but they returned because of what they found in his presence. A peace that had been seasoned by loss, but not diminished by it. A joy that ran deeper than circumstance. A wisdom that could only be earned through decades of finding reasons for thanksgiving, even when reasons for complaint seemed more obvious. Marcus, a teenager whose parents had recently divorced, had started stopping by after school to help with tasks that were becoming too difficult for Samuel's aging body. The old man was grateful for strong young hands that could dig and lift and carry, but he was even more grateful for the opportunity to share with Marcus the garden's stories of resilience, of beauty that could grow from brokenness, of hope that could survive even the harshest winters. Their conversations as they worked side by side became lessons in the kind of gratitude that transforms hardship into wisdom, pain into compassion, questions into deeper faith. Sarah, a young mother struggling with postpartum depression, had found healing among the garden's pathways, as Samuel gently shared stories of seasons when his own hope had felt as fragile as seedlings in late frost. He was grateful for the chance to offer comfort that came not from theoretical knowledge, but from personal experience of grace that had sustained him through his own dark nights of the soul. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where beauty persisted despite difficulty, where growth continued even when progress seemed imperceptible. An elderly couple from the assisted living facility down the road had become regular visitors, finding in Samuel's garden a reminder of their own younger days when they had tended plants and watched seasons turn with the satisfaction of partnership in creation's ongoing work. Samuel was grateful for their stories of gardens past, for the way shared memories of soil and seed and harvest created bonds that transcended differences of age or background, for the reminder that gratitude was a universal language that could bridge any gap between human hearts. The seasonal rhythms of the garden had become Samuel's calendar and his liturgy, marking time not by human schedules, but by nature's reliable progression from dormancy to growth, to harvest to rest. Spring brought the grateful anticipation of renewal, the joy of seeing bulbs push through thawing earth, the satisfaction of preparing soil for another year of partnership between human intention and divine provision. He was thankful for the energy that returned with lengthening days, for the hope that stirred in his heart as surely as sap rose in maple trees, for the way new life could always surprise him even after decades of witnessing the same miraculous cycle. Summer blessed him with abundance that exceeded every expectation, tomatoes that grew larger and sweeter than seemed possible, flowers that bloomed with unusual intensity, herbs that flavoured meals and memories with equal richness. Samuel was grateful for the privilege of participating in such extravagance, for surplus that could be shared with neighbours and strangers, for the way generosity given freely always seemed to return multiplied through unexpected channels. Autumn painted his garden in shades of gratitude that no artist could improve, the very air seeming to celebrate the completion of another cycle of growth and harvest. Samuel was grateful for the satisfaction of preservation, work canning tomatoes, drying herbs, saving seeds for next year's planting activities that connected him to generations of gardeners who had understood that gratitude required not just receiving abundance, but preparing for seasons of scarcity with wisdom and hope. Winter drew him indoors, but not away from the garden's influence as he planned next year's additions, studied seed catalogues with the enthusiasm of a child browsing toy stores, sketched improvements that would honour both practical needs and aesthetic dreams. He was grateful for these months of rest and reflection, for the way dormancy prepared for growth, for the trust that spring would return even when winter seemed determined to claim permanent victory. The young people who had become part of Samuel's extended garden family often asked him about the secret of his success, wondering how someone with no formal training in horticulture could create such extraordinary beauty from ordinary materials. His answer was always the same. Gratitude was the only fertilizer that never failed to produce abundance. Appreciation was the best tool for cultivating anything worth growing. Thanksgiving was the foundation upon which all lasting beauty was built. Samuel's grateful heart had learned that gardens were not just places but practices, not just spaces but spiritual disciplines, not just hobbies but ways of participating in the ongoing conversation between divine creativity and human response. Every seed planted was an act of faith. Every flower that bloomed was a gift received with wonder. Every harvest gathered was a reminder that generosity given freely always returned multiplied through channels that exceeded human ability to predict or control. As evening approached and Samuel made his final tour of the garden before darkness claimed the day, he moved among the plants like a pastor among his congregation, grateful for each one's contribution to the beauty that surrounded him. He was thankful for roses that continued Margaret's legacy of insisting on beauty, even when practicality might seem more important, for vegetables that fed not only bodies, but souls hungry for the satisfaction of honest labour rewarded with honest abundance, for the way every corner of this acre held memories of people loved and lessons learned through the patient practice of grateful cultivation. The garden that had begun as empty land had become a living testament to the truth that gratitude, given time and consistent expression, could transform any barren space into abundant beauty, any ordinary moment into sacred encounter, any simple activity into profound spiritual practice. Samuel's grateful heart had created not just a place of beauty, but a sanctuary where others could learn that thanksgiving was not just appropriate response to blessing, but the doorway through which deeper blessings could enter lives willing to receive them with appreciation, wonder, and the kind of hope that plants seeds even when harvest seems impossibly distant. In a small farmhouse where the morning light filtered through windows that had witnessed 3 generations of sunrise breakfasts, Elena kneaded bread dough with hands that had learned to find abundance in scarcity, hope in uncertainty, and reasons for gratitude, even when the pantry shelves grew thin and the future seemed as uncertain as weather. The rhythm of her work had become a prayer, each fold and turn of the dough a meditation on provision that came in forms both expected and surprising, a physical expression of faith that tomorrow's needs would be met even when today's resources seemed insufficient for the challenges ahead. The drought had lasted longer than anyone in the valley could remember, turning once green fields into expanses of cracked earth that seemed to mock the memory of abundant harvests from previous years. Elena's husband Jose worked longer hours for wages that bought less food. Their 3 children asked fewer questions about treats they had once taken for granted, and neighbours spoke in hushed tones about families who had already given up and moved to the city in search of opportunities that rural life could no longer provide. Yet Eleanor's heart remained stubbornly grateful, choosing to focus on gifts that remained rather than blessings that had been withdrawn. She was thankful for the well behind their house that still produced clear, sweet water when so many others in the region had run dry, for the small vegetable garden that Jose had managed to keep alive through careful rationing of their precious water supply, for the handful of chickens that continued to provide eggs, even though their laying had decreased with the stress of the unrelenting heat. Elena appreciated the way hardship had stripped away excess and revealed essentials, teaching her family to value simple gifts they had previously overlooked in their assumption that abundance was their natural inheritance rather than undeserved grace. The flour for today's bread represented careful calculation and hopeful faith in equal measure. Elena had measured out exactly enough for 2 loaves, one for her family's meals for the next 2 days, another to share with the Martinez family next door, whose situation had become even more desperate than their own since Miguel had injured his back and could no longer work the construction jobs that had provided their primary income. She was grateful for the opportunity to give, for resources that could be stretched to cover not just her own family's needs, but something extra for neighbours who had become more than friends through shared struggle. As Eleanor worked the dough, she thought about her grandmother's stories of even harder times when the revolution had swept through their region, leaving destruction and uncertainty in its wake, when families had survived on whatever they could forage or grow in secret, when gratitude had been the difference between despair and endurance. Her abuela had taught her that thanksgiving was not dependent on abundance, but was actually most powerful when practiced during seasons of want, that appreciation for small gifts could create contentment that vast wealth could not guarantee, that hearts grateful for little often received much, while hearts demanding much often remained empty regardless of their circumstances. The smell of baking bread began to fill the small kitchen as Elena slid the loaves into the oven that Jose had built from local clay and stones salvaged from a demolished building. She was grateful for his skilled hands that could create useful things from discarded materials, for the way necessity had awakened creativity they hadn't known they possessed, for the satisfaction that came from making do with what they had rather than waiting for what they wished they could afford. Their home might lack many conveniences that others considered essential, but it had become rich in the things that mattered most. Love expressed through practical service, hope shared during difficult times, gratitude that multiplied small blessings into sufficient joy. While the bread baked, Eleanor prepared the vegetables from their garden for the soup that would accompany their evening meal. Each tomato, each onion, each sprig of herbs represented careful tending during months when every drop of water had to be conserved, every plant protected from the scorching sun that had turned neighbours' gardens into graveyards of withered hope. She was grateful for Jose's persistence in watering their small plot before dawn and after sunset, for the way their children had learned to help without complaint, for the miracle of growth that continued even under the most challenging conditions. Their 10-year-old daughter Maria appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the aroma of fresh bread that had become a rare treat in recent months. Elena was grateful for the smile that spread across her daughter's face, for the way simple pleasures could still bring joy despite their reduced circumstances, for children whose resilience reminded her daily that contentment was more about attitude than possessions. Maria had stopped asking for the toys and clothes her friends at school discussed, had learned to find entertainment in books borrowed from the travelling library and games invented from household items, had developed a maturity that was both impressive and heartbreaking in someone so young. "Mama, can I help you take bread to Senora Martinez?" Maria asked, her eagerness to participate in acts of kindness filling Eleanor's heart with grateful pride. She was thankful for children who had learned generosity despite having little to give, who understood instinctively that sharing multiplied joy while hoarding diminished it, who had absorbed from daily example the truth that gratitude expressed through action was more powerful than gratitude merely felt or spoken. Together, mother and daughter walked the short distance to their neighbour's house, carrying a still warm loaf wrapped in a clean kitchen towel and a small jar of honey that Eleanor had been saving for a special occasion. She had decided that sharing with friends in need was special enough to justify opening the precious sweetness that represented both luxury and love in their current circumstances. Elena was grateful for the opportunity to transform hoarded treasure into shared blessing, for the way giving freely created abundance that scarcity could never diminish. Senora Martinez answered their knock with eyes that spoke of worry barely held in check, but her expression transformed into grateful joy when she saw their offering. Elena was thankful for the tears that sprang to her neighbour's eyes, for the way simple kindness could communicate hope more effectively than elaborate speeches, for the privilege of being an instrument through which divine provision could reach another family struggling to maintain faith during difficult times. "I was just wondering what I could make for dinner," Senora Martinez whispered, her voice thick with emotion that she was trying to contain in front of the children. "Miguel is resting, trying to heal from his injury, and I have been stretching our last rice to last as long as possible. This bread—" She held the loaf as if it were made of gold rather than flour and water. Elena was grateful for the reminder that her simple offering was received as treasure, that gratitude from the recipient could transform the giver's understanding of their own gift's value. The women embraced briefly, a gesture that carried volumes of unspoken understanding about the challenges they faced and the hope they shared that better times would eventually return to their valley. Elena was grateful for friendships deepened by adversity, for the way shared struggle could create bonds stronger than shared prosperity, for neighbours who had become family through mutual support during seasons when support from official sources remained inadequate or entirely absent. As they walked home, Maria asked thoughtful questions about why some families had more than others, why good people sometimes faced hard times, why sharing seemed to make their own small portion feel more satisfying rather than less. Elena was grateful for her daughter's curiosity, for opportunities to discuss complex questions that had no simple answers, for the chance to pass on lessons about gratitude and generosity that could not be taught through lectures, but had to be demonstrated through daily choices and consistent example. That evening, as their own family gathered around their small table for a meal that was simple but sufficient, Elena felt her heart overflow with thanksgiving for blessings that were easy to overlook when they were taken for granted. She was grateful for Jose's steady presence, despite the stress of uncertain employment, for children who had learned to find contentment in small pleasures, for a roof that kept out rain and walls that provided security in an insecure world. The bread they shared had been made from the same flour, baked in the same oven, shaped by the same hands as the loaf they had given away, yet it somehow tasted richer for having been part of an act of generosity. Elena was grateful for the mysterious mathematics of love that seemed to multiply resources when they were shared freely, that created abundance from scarcity when gratitude rather than fear governed the heart's calculations. After dinner, as the family sat together in their small living room sharing stories and simple games that required no purchased equipment, Elena reflected on the way hardship had stripped away distractions and revealed treasures that prosperity had kept hidden. She was grateful for conversations with her children that might never have happened if television and electronic devices had remained affordable, for the way necessity had drawn them closer together rather than driving them apart, for discovering that contentment was possible even when circumstances were challenging. News arrived the following week that rain was finally coming, that government assistance programs were being expanded to help families like theirs, that construction projects were resuming, and jobs would soon be available for workers like Jose and Miguel. Elena was grateful for hope validated, for prayers answered, for the promise that their season of difficulty was approaching its end. But as she prepared bread for the celebration dinner they planned to share with the Martinez family and other neighbors who had supported each other through the difficult months, Elena realized that she was also grateful for the lessons learned during hardship, for the way scarcity had taught appreciation for abundance, for the discovery that happiness was not dependent on having everything they wanted, but on being thankful for what they had been given. The feast they shared that evening was modest by some standards, but felt magnificently abundant to hearts that had learned to find reasons for celebration in simple gifts. Elena was grateful for community that had been strengthened by shared struggle, for friendships that had been deepened by mutual support, for the way gratitude practiced during difficulty had prepared them to receive returning prosperity with appropriate humility and joy. The bread she served that night was made from the same simple ingredients she had used throughout the months of scarcity, but it was offered by hands that had been changed by the experience of giving when resources were limited, received by hearts that had been opened by the practice of gratitude when gratitude required intentional choice rather than automatic response. Elena's grateful heart had learned that true abundance was not measured by the fullness of pantries, but by the fullness of appreciation, not by the security of bank accounts, but by the security of knowing that love shared multiplied love received, that bread given freely somehow always returned in forms that exceeded the original offering. Her family had discovered that gratitude could transform any meal into a feast, any shelter into a sanctuary, any hardship into an opportunity for grace to reveal itself in ways that prosperity could never teach. Captain Thomas Morrison stood on the deck of his fishing vessel as waves the size of buildings rose and fell around him with the terrible majesty of a storm that had grown beyond all prediction, beyond all preparation, beyond anything his 40 years of sailing had taught him to expect from even the most violent seas. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts warning all vessels to seek immediate shelter, but shelter was now beyond their reach, and survival had become a matter of riding out forces that made human effort seem as insignificant as a child's paper boat in a tsunami. Yet even as fear gripped his experienced sailor's heart, Thomas found himself grateful for the skills that decades on the water had given him, for the sturdy vessel beneath his feet, for the crew whose trust in his leadership had never wavered, even as their situation grew increasingly desperate. The storm had come from nowhere, as ocean storms sometimes do, transforming a routine fishing expedition into a battle for survival that would test everything Thomas thought he knew about seamanship, leadership, and the mysterious ways that divine providence works through human courage and natural forces alike. His grateful heart had been forged through years of smaller storms weathered, lesser crises navigated, countless nights when danger had been averted through skill and luck working together in ways that he had learned to call grace rather than coincidence. Thomas was grateful for his father's training, for the old fisherman who had taken his teenage son to sea in all kinds of weather, teaching him to read wind and wave, to respect the ocean's power while learning to work with its rhythms rather than against them. Those early lessons had included more than seamanship. They had encompassed a philosophy of life that found reasons for thanksgiving, even in circumstances that seemed to offer nothing but cause for complaint or fear. His father had taught him that the sea was both adversary and ally, that storms could be teachers as well as threats, that gratitude was the sailor's best compass when all other navigation failed. The crew of the Sarah's Hope included men Thomas had sailed with for years, experienced fishermen whose courage and competence had earned his complete trust through seasons of ordinary danger and extraordinary reward. Now, as they worked together to secure equipment that threatened to break loose and damage the boat, as they took turns at the wheel, fighting to keep their vessel pointed into waves that could crush them if approached from the wrong angle, Thomas was grateful for their steady presence, for voices that remained calm despite the chaos surrounding them, for hands that performed essential tasks without need for instruction or encouragement. Young Danny Martinez, making only his third voyage as a member of Thomas's crew, had been sick with fear and seasickness during the first hours of the storm, but he had gradually found his courage as the night wore on, and his more experienced shipmates showed him by example how to function despite terror. Thomas was grateful for the way crisis could reveal character, for the opportunity to witness a boy becoming a man under circumstances that would test veterans, for the reminder that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act appropriately despite fear's presence. The engine room, where Chief Engineer Pete Rodriguez maintained the diesel that powered their vessel, had become partially flooded as seawater forced its way through seals that had seemed adequate for normal conditions, but proved insufficient for the extraordinary stresses of this storm. Pete worked in knee-deep water, fighting to keep their power plant running despite conditions that would have defeated less experienced mechanics. His grateful heart focused on machinery that continued to function when it had every reason to fail. Thomas was grateful for Pete's expertise, for his refusal to give up despite overwhelming difficulties, for the way dedication to duty could triumph over circumstances that seemed designed to guarantee failure. As dawn approached without bringing any decrease in the storm's intensity, Thomas found himself remembering other storms survived, other nights when survival had seemed impossible, but morning had come anyway, bringing calm seas and renewed appreciation for life's fundamental gifts. He was grateful for the memory of his wife Sarah, for whom the boat was named, whose courage during her final illness had taught him that grace could be found in any circumstance if one knew how to look for it. Her example had shown him that gratitude was not dependent on favourable conditions, but was actually most powerful when practiced during seasons of greatest trial. The radio brought news that other vessels in the area were also struggling, that Coast Guard resources were stretched beyond capacity by the number of distress calls, that rescue might not be available even for boats in the most desperate situations. Rather than increasing his despair, this information somehow strengthened Thomas's resolve and deepened his gratitude for his crew's competence, for their vessel's seaworthiness, for the knowledge that they had resources within themselves to face whatever the storm might bring. He was thankful for the independence that came from skill and preparation, for the way self-reliance could coexist with faith in divine providence. The storm tested every system on the Sarah's Hope, revealing weaknesses that had been hidden during normal operations, but also demonstrating strengths that Thomas had not fully appreciated during easier times. He was grateful for the boat's solid construction, for the builder who had used extra steel and reinforcement in places where cheaper alternatives might have been adequate for fair weather, but proved essential for survival in extreme conditions. Each joint that held, each plate that remained secure, each component that continued to function became a reason for thanksgiving in the midst of circumstances that could easily have inspired only fear and desperation. By midday, when the storm should have been beginning to weaken according to weather patterns Thomas understood, the winds instead increased to levels that pushed his experience beyond anything he had previously encountered. Waves began breaking over the wheelhouse, forcing him to navigate by instinct and prayer when visibility dropped to zero and normal reference points disappeared entirely. He was grateful for intuition developed through decades of reading the sea's moods, for the way his hands seemed to know the right response even when his mind could not calculate the proper course, for guidance that came from sources deeper than training or experience. The afternoon brought a new crisis when their mainmast, weakened by hours of extraordinary stress, finally snapped in a gust that seemed designed specifically to test the limits of human engineering and natural materials. As rigging crashed to the deck and essential communication equipment was damaged beyond repair, Thomas felt a moment of despair that threatened to overwhelm the courage he had maintained throughout the previous 18 hours. But even in that darkest moment, gratitude reasserted itself as he realized that the falling mast had missed the wheelhouse by mere inches, that his crew had been positioned safely away from the danger zone, that what could have been a tragedy had become merely another challenge to overcome. Without radio communication, the Sarah's Hope was truly on her own, cut off from weather updates, rescue coordination, or even the comfort of knowing that someone on shore was aware of their position and condition. Yet Thomas found this isolation strangely liberating, freeing him from dependence on external assistance and forcing him to rely completely on the resources that were immediately available. He was grateful for this clarification of their situation, for the way complete self-reliance could sharpen focus and eliminate distractions, for the reminder that survival often depended more on internal resources than external support. As evening approached and the storm entered its second full day, exhaustion began to take its toll on the crew, despite their determination to maintain alertness. Thomas implemented a rotation system that allowed each man short periods of rest, while ensuring that essential positions remained staffed, grateful for the way shared responsibility could distribute the burden of leadership. For crew members who understood their roles without needing constant supervision, for the trust that allowed him to delegate critical tasks even under extreme pressure. The night brought an unexpected gift, stars visible through breaks in the storm clouds, providing the first reliable navigation reference they had enjoyed since the crisis began. Thomas was grateful for these glimpses of celestial guidance, for the way traditional seamanship skills remained relevant even in an age of electronic navigation, for the reminder that some sources of direction were more reliable than others, that ancient methods of finding one's way could serve when modern technology failed. By the third dawn, the storm finally began to show signs of weakening, though seas remained dangerous and their position was still uncertain. As visibility improved, Thomas spotted other vessels that had also survived the ordeal, their presence confirming that they were not alone in their struggle, that others had also found ways to endure what had seemed unendurable. He was grateful for this community of survivors, for the shared experience that created instant bonds between strangers, for the way crisis could reveal the fundamental connections that linked all who challenged the sea for their livelihood. The journey home took 2 more days as they nursed their damaged vessel through seas that gradually returned to normal patterns. But Thomas's grateful heart was already planning the repairs and improvements that would prepare the Sarah's Hope for future storms. He was thankful for lessons learned through direct experience, for weaknesses revealed that could be strengthened, for the way survival itself became a foundation for future confidence and competence. When they finally reached port, Thomas found that news of their survival had preceded them, that families and friends had maintained vigil throughout the 3 days of uncertainty, that their safe return was being celebrated by people who understood from their own experience the risks that came with making a living from the sea. He was grateful for this community that understood without explanation, for relationships deepened by shared danger, for the way near loss could heighten appreciation for what had been preserved. In the weeks that followed, as the Sarah's Hope underwent repairs and Thomas reflected on the lessons learned during their trial by storm, he found that his gratitude continued to deepen rather than fade with time. He was thankful for the discovery that courage could be sustained even when hope seemed unreasonable, that grace could be found even in circumstances that seemed designed to break the human spirit, that survival itself was a gift that could transform one's entire perspective on life's ordinary blessings. The story of their survival spread throughout the fishing community, becoming part of the lore that connected generations of those who made their living from the sea. Thomas was grateful for the way their experience could encourage others facing their own storms, for the reminder that divine providence worked through human courage and competence, for the knowledge that gratitude practiced during crisis could become a foundation for faith that no future storm could shake. Thomas's grateful heart had learned that storms could be teachers as well as threats, that survival itself was a gift to be received with humility and appreciation, that the same forces that could destroy could also reveal strengths and resources that remained hidden during easier times. His experience had shown him that gratitude was not just appropriate response to blessing, but the compass that could guide anyone through life's inevitable storms towards safe harbour and renewed appreciation for all that makes existence precious, meaningful, and ultimately blessed beyond human ability to fully comprehend or adequately acknowledge. In the golden hour before sunset, when the autumn light painted everything with the warm hues of Thanksgiving, the community of Millfield gathered in the town square for their annual harvest celebration, a tradition that had grown organically from the individual stories of gratitude that had woven themselves together into a tapestry of shared appreciation for life's abundant gifts. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by families whose own stories echoed the ancient themes of faithfulness, rewarded, hardship transformed, and grace discovered in the most unexpected places and circumstances. Martha Chen, now in her 90s but still moving with the careful dignity of one who had learned to be grateful for each day's mobility, carried a basket of vegetables from the garden she attended with Hannah's gentle guidance before her friend's passing the previous spring. The elderly Chinese woman had become one of the celebration's most beloved figures, her presence a living bridge between the immigrant experience and the longer story of all who had found reasons for Thanksgiving in American soil. She was grateful for the community that had embraced her family decades earlier, for friendships that had transcended cultural differences, for the way gratitude spoken in any language could be understood by hearts prepared to receive it. Young Marcus, now a college student studying agriculture with plans to return to Millfield as a sustainable farming consultant, helped arrange tables with the easy strength of someone who had learned through Samuel's patient teaching that physical labour could be a form of worship when performed with grateful hands. His teenage years of depression following his parents' divorce had been transformed by hours spent in the old gardener's sanctuary, learning that growth often happened underground before becoming visible, that seasons of dormancy prepared for seasons of abundance. He was grateful for mentorship that had changed the trajectory of his life, for the discovery that healing could come through helping things grow, for the privilege of carrying forward wisdom that connected him to generations of those who had found hope in the soil. Sarah Martinez, whose own children now played among the harvest displays with the unconscious joy of those who had never known real want, supervised the children's activities with the patient love of one whose own childhood struggles had taught her to appreciate simple pleasures that others might take for granted. Her mother Eleanor's example during the drought years had shaped Sarah's understanding that gratitude was not dependent on circumstances, but was the foundation upon which lasting happiness could be built, regardless of external conditions. She was grateful for lessons learned through hardship, for the way scarcity had taught appreciation for abundance, for parents who had demonstrated that contentment was possible even when resources were limited. The aroma of fresh bread filled the evening air as Eleanor herself, now silver-haired but still strong, arranged loaves that represented more than food. They carried memories of sharing during difficult times, of neighbours who had become family through mutual support, of the mysterious mathematics of love that multiplied resources when they were given freely rather than hoarded fearfully. She was grateful for the way their community's story had become one of resilience and mutual aid, for children who had learned generosity by witnessing it daily, for the discovery that gratitude practiced during difficulty prepared hearts to receive returning prosperity with appropriate humility and joy. Captain Thomas Morrison had driven inland from the coast especially for this celebration, bringing with him stories of storms weathered and safe harbours reached that had become part of the community's lore about finding courage in crisis. His weathered hands, steady from decades of holding the wheel in rough seas, now helped elderly residents to their seats with the gentle strength of one who had learned that true power was best expressed through service to others. He was grateful for the opportunity to share his story with those facing their own storms, for the reminder that survival itself was a gift that created responsibility to encourage others, for the way gratitude practiced during crisis could become a foundation for faith that no future trial could shake. Father Michael moved among the gathering with the quiet joy of a pastor whose congregation had taught him more about practical faith than any theological seminary could provide. His conversations with Hannah during her final months had deepened his understanding that ministry was often about learning from parishioners rather than teaching them, about receiving wisdom from those whose lives had been libraries of lived gratitude. He was grateful for the privilege of serving a community that had shown him authentic spirituality in action, for the way simple faith lived consistently could transform ordinary places into sanctuaries, ordinary moments into encounters with the sacred. The tables themselves told stories of gratitude expressed through countless acts of preparation and presentation. Mrs. Patterson's apple pies, made from fruit grown in the orchard her late husband had planted 40 years earlier, represented faithfulness that extended beyond single lifetimes, investment in future joy that required present sacrifice. The quilts that covered some tables had been stitched by the church women's group from fabric scraps that would have been discarded, transformed through patient work into beautiful testimony that nothing need be wasted when it was received with grateful hands and creative hearts. As the sun sank lower and the evening light grew more golden, the gathered community represented more than a single town's celebration. They embodied the universal human story of finding reasons for thanksgiving, despite circumstances that could easily inspire complaint, of discovering abundance in the midst of apparent scarcity, of creating beauty from brokenness through the patient practice of grateful living. Their individual stories had woven together into a collective testimony that gratitude was not just appropriate response to blessing, but the foundation upon which lasting joy could be built. The youngest members of the community, children who had grown up hearing these stories of gratitude, lived and shared, moved through the celebration with the natural joy of those who had absorbed from daily example that life itself was gift, that ordinary moments were shot through with extraordinary grace, that appreciation could transform any experience into opportunity for wonder. They were grateful in the unconscious way that children could be when surrounded by adults who had learned to notice gifts that others might overlook. An impromptu sharing time developed as the formal meal concluded, with community members offering brief testimonies about reasons for gratitude that had emerged from their own experiences of challenge and grace. These were not polished speeches, but simple acknowledgements of gifts received, lessons learned, and hope discovered in places where despair might have seemed more logical. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of shared appreciation that had become the community's most precious possession. A young single mother spoke of finding support from neighbours when her own family had been unable to help, of discovering that community could be chosen as well as inherited, of learning that gratitude for small kindnesses could open doors to larger blessings. An elderly farmer testified to 40 years of harvests that had taught him to be grateful for rain and sunshine alike, for seasons of abundance and seasons of rest, for the privilege of participating in the ongoing conversation between human effort and divine provision that produced food for both body and soul. The town librarian shared her gratitude for books that had carried her through lonely periods, for authors whose words had become companions during difficult times, for the way stories could connect her to experiences and wisdom that transcended the boundaries of her own limited circumstances. A recently retired teacher spoke of 30 years of students who had taught her more than she had taught them, of young minds that had kept her own thinking fresh, of the privilege of witnessing countless moments when understanding dawned and potential began to unfold. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above their gathering, the community's shared gratitude seemed to create its own illumination, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with hearts that had learned to recognize gifts in forms both obvious and subtle. Their thanksgiving was not naive optimism that ignored life's genuine difficulties, but mature appreciation that had been tested by trial and proven reliable, even when circumstances suggested that complaint would be more logical than celebration. The evening concluded not with formal benediction, but with the natural dispersal of people whose hearts had been filled and whose gratitude had been renewed through the simple act of gathering with others who had learned similar lessons about finding joy in unexpected places. They carried home more than leftover food. They took with them renewed appreciation for the community that had nurtured their individual growth, for stories that had become shared treasure, for the ongoing opportunity to practice gratitude in ways that would create more reasons for future Thanksgiving. The town square, empty now, except for the lingering aroma of shared feast and the gentle rustle of autumn leaves in the evening breeze, held within its boundaries the accumulated gratitude of generations who had learned that thankfulness was not just annual celebration, but daily practice, not just emotional response, but spiritual discipline, not just individual attitude, but communal foundation upon which lasting joy could be built. The harvest they had celebrated was more than agricultural. It was the fruit of grateful hearts that had discovered abundance, not by getting everything they wanted, but by appreciating everything they had received. In the quiet that followed celebration, the very air seemed to vibrate with thanksgiving that had been spoken and unspoken, expressed and implied, shared and received, in the endless circulation of gratitude that connected human hearts across differences of age, background, experience, and circumstance. Their grateful hearts had learned that appreciation was the seed from which all other blessings grew, that thanksgiving was the soil in which hope could take root and flourish, that gratitude practiced faithfully could transform any life into a harvest worthy of celebration, any community into a sanctuary where grace could be recognized, received, and shared in endless abundance that blessed both giver and receiver beyond human ability to calculate or contain,